So the next tier we're calling flawed, but can't totally rule out because, these teams, they all clearly have some issues or shortcomings that are likely to hold them back come postseason time. They likely are not going to make the finals. They likely peak out as maybe a conference finals if they get lucky with the right matchup. But they still, for one reason or another, they're really solid teams. They've been there before to an extent. They've got star power. They have a shot, in almost any series they play, they're going to have a chance, especially as teams that could probably win a round or two. You know what I mean? But starting off, number 11, the Los Angeles Clippers. And this is one that I just got to eat. I was down on them. I predicted them to be the 13th seed in the West. I thought that Kawhi was not a guarantee to play all season long. I thought that without him, they were going to be kind of a disaster on offense, which, they've obviously been better defensively than they have offensively. So that was fair a little bit to a degree there. But they've been way better defensively than I even thought they would be. They're fourth in defensive rating on the season. And on offense, they're 22nd, but they've been able to do enough. And I think it's been a little bit of a renaissance year for James Harden, who is posting a career high usage since 2020 back with Houston. So the highest he's had in the post-Rockets era. And Norman Powell has obviously been a huge breakout guy for them, who got some discussion for the All-Star game, averaged 24 a game this season on ridiculously good efficiency, 49% from the field, 42% from three. And look, they've got Kawhi back now. He's easing back in. He's only played 19 games on the season. He still sits out back-to-backs, but he's worked his way up into respectable minutes. He's played 37 plus in the last two games, was in the 32 to 33 range the couple before that. But he's looked a little better recently. I think it was a little clunky at first with him trying to reintegrate him into the lineup, but in his last 5 games, he's 24 a game, 6 rebounds, 4 assists, 47% from the field, 44% from three. So those are vintage Kawhi numbers. And if he can do that, then that totally changes the ceiling on this team. I think this has been a really good stock up season for Harden, just in the sense that people totally had wrote him off at this point, but he deserved his all-star appearance. He has been everything for this team. The heart and soul of what everything that they do, particularly on the offensive end. But they've just got a lot of really good players on this team. I mean, Ty Lue's a great coach, obviously, but then their starting 5 unit of Kawhi, Harden, Powell, Derek Jones Jr., and Zubats, they're a plus 26.6 net rating on the season. And, it's a small sample size because as soon as Kawhi came back, then Powell gets hurt. And so he's been out for a little bit now. But still, their 5-man unit is as good as anyone's in the league in terms of just how they performed to this point. And then I really like the Bogdanović addition. I know he hasn't shot the ball super well, but he gives them a little bit more spark that they've needed, particularly when Norman Powell's out. I think Ben Simmons has been giving them some decent minutes, as just a kind of switch up, a potential small ball 5 option. Then Amir Coffey, Chris Dunn's been awesome for them. Batum still plays some spot minutes here and there. They've got some pieces. And I think their top 8 to 9 guys is a really, really solid unit. They play hard defensively, and they have an identity, which a lot of these teams don't. We look back at some of the year from hell teams like Philadelphia, Phoenix. Like, they have nothing to fall back on. That's like, this is the core of what we want to do as a team. The Clippers, their defensive identity has been just everything for them. And credit to Jeff Van Gundy, who's been sort of their defensive coordinator that they've been coining it as this season. But this is the best defensive team we've seen in the Kawhi Leonard era in Los Angeles. And like I said, they're doing just enough offensively. And all year, I think people thought they were frisky, but they'll fall off. And they haven't fallen off. They're a damn good team. But the thing with the Clippers is that, come postseason time, Kawhi Leonard has not been able to be healthy, and James Harden has been a shell of himself. That's just what it's been for both of these guys. And so while I really do I think they're a legitimately good team, and I think they're going to be an annoying team to play in the playoffs. And if they're fully healthy, there could be a threat to, make a conference finals. But the problem is I've seen it too much with Kawhi. I've seen it too much with Harden. And so I can't trust it until I see it with them. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But Kawhi hasn't made it through a postseason since 2020 in the bubble. And James Harden just year after year after year falls flat in the postseason. He can have some good games, but it's going to be sandwiched between some absolute stinkers. And if he's putting up goose eggs and Kawhi's not playing, then this team stands no chance. And so if I'm being honest, I think it's likely that one of those things happens, if not both of them happens. And so at that point, they are much more pretenders than contenders. But I just want to say that, they've had a really good year. I think they're a really good team, but they're too much of a theoretical team. They're too much of a if everything goes right team, which things have not gone right for them in this era. So I don't know why that would change now. Then, number 10, we have the Minnesota Timberwolves. And it has been a roller coaster year to an extent with them. They trade Karl-Anthony Towns in the offseason, which, kind of felt like a money move. I don't think anybody really thought that Julius Randle was a better fit for this team. I don't think anybody thinks Julius Randle is a better player than Towns. They get Dante DiVincenzo in the process as well and a first-round pick. But DiVincenzo's had not a great year. You couple that with the fact that Mike Conley has sort of fallen off a cliff this season. He's still shooting decently from outside, but he's not nearly the efficient player he's been over the last few seasons. And he has just lost a step as an initiator and shot creator and even defensively a little bit as well. So, and with Conley being a little bit of a compromised version of himself or declined or whatever you want to call it, it's hurt Gobert too. Because, that was a really nice little pick and roll combination for them. Gobert's played his best offensive basketball next to Conley, first in Utah, then in Minnesota. And so he's been less of a threat offensively. The spacing fit with him and Randle has not been great. Randle's shooting only 32% from deep this season. It's looked clunky at times, and they've kind of devolved into a very Anthony Edwards reliant team, which it didn't. Obviously, he's been the guy there, but it didn't feel that way in the past. But now, just to bring up a couple different stats, in losses this season, Anthony Edwards is shooting only 40.8% from the field, and in wins, he's shooting 47%. And of course, it makes sense that correlation between your best player playing well or not and wins and losses. But that's a huge difference. 47% is very solid for a score first guard. 41% is really not good. That's a very inefficient. So it feels like if Ant's making shots, they win games. If he's not, they don't. And that's not a very sustainable formula, in my opinion. He's having to take a lot more shots this season just as a product of the team around him because Randle's been banged up a little bit. And then you look at the comparison between like Naz Reid and Julius Randle, for example. I think Naz Reid has, I won't say he became overrated, but just all of the discourse of like he can be 80% of what Towns can be. I mean, we're just seeing that that's not the case. He's a really nice, good player, but he's not Towns. He's not the shooter that Towns is. He's not the low post player that Towns is. He doesn't have the size that Towns does, the offensive versatility that Towns brings to a team. So that was unfairly put on him. But even with that, I still think Naz Reid has been a better fit for this team than Randle, and the numbers bear it out. I mean, with Randle on the court, they're a plus 2.8. With him off the court, they're a plus 5. With Naz Reid on the court, they're a plus 6.2. With him off the court, they're a plus 0.4. So, when Reid plays, they're clearly better. When Randle plays, they're clearly not as good. And so it's complicated things because there's obviously just the built-in reputation and ego that Randle's going to have. And so, but they're probably a better version of themselves with him not in the starting lineup and more running the second unit. But it's just been inconsistent around Ant. Everybody's been a little bit inconsistent across the board. Ant has changed his style of play where he's very three-point shot heavy, which I think is good for him overall in the long term, but it creates more variability in his games, as we've seen with the stats I mentioned with wins, losses. But I still believe that with Anthony Edwards on your team and a good defense, which they still are a good defensive team, they're not the number one defense they were last year, but they're still sixth. And with that, I think that they are going to be a tough out for whoever they play. I still think they're going to get into the postseason. They've been right in the play-in discussion 7 to 9 seed range all season long. But I think that they play good teams tough. They've gotten some good contributions out of some of their young guys like Jalen Clark, Rob Dillingham, Terrence Shannon Jr. have been getting more minutes recently. And so they've got a lot of options. I like the depth that they have on the team. It's just going to be about picking the right spots and picking the right rotation for certain situations. And I think they're a team that is uniquely going to be very dependent on something like that, because there might be some matchups where Randall is a better option. There might be some nights where Naz Reid's got to be the guy. There might be nights where Conley looks like his old self. There might be nights where Dillingham is making shots, and so he's going to be hard to keep off the court. And so their rotation is still a work in progress, which is a little worrisome to an extent this late in the season, but at the same time, it's good to have options, obviously. So it'll be interesting to see the strings that Chris Finch pulls. But as I said, when you've got Ant, I'm just a believer in this guy, and I think that come postseason time, we saw what he did last year, and if he's playing at that level that we know he can, I still think Minnesota is a viable team that can make a little bit of a run and win a couple rounds in the West. Even though they haven't played consistently like they did last season, I still think it's on the table. But ultimately, after this year, I think they've got to move on from Randall, and they've got to try to find another reliable offensive guy next to Ant, because what they're doing with him right now is not sustainable across a multi-season sample size and into the postseason, because they're just asking too much out of him. But he's capable of it, which is why I can't totally rule them out as sort of like a pseudo contender that could make a deep run, but the consistency just hasn't been there. Number 9, we have the Memphis Grizzlies, which they have been really consistent all year long. You know, they're currently the 4 seed. They haven't played their absolute best basketball recently, but they're still 38-22. You know, they've been a top 4 seed in the West really the entire season. But I still do have my concerns about them, and it all starts with Ja Morant, because he is just not had a vintage Ja Morant season. You know, this is a guy that was making all NBA teams. That was a no-brainer all-star. That was a guy that was averaging 26, 27 a game. That was right in the thick of the MVP discussion just a few years ago. But he's not near that level right now. You know, it's been a weird year for him. Not only just he's only played 37 games. Feels like he's not put together a consistent 2 to 3 weeks of playing every single night, which of course maybe that's them trying to preserve him, and maybe that will pay off come postseason time. But even when he's been out there, he's got a career low field goal percentage this season of 43%, career low shooting from 2-point range at just under 50%. He's got career high in turnover percentage, turnovers per game. He's shooting the highest number of shots from 3-point range in his career, while also shooting the lowest percentage-wise in terms of making it from deep at only 28.7% from 3. He's got a career low percentage of shots taken at the rim this season. His rookie season, he was 49% from there, 42% the next year, 43 the year after that, 40 the year after that, and then this year only 37%. So career low there. And then he's got the second lowest percentage of making shots at the rim this season as well at only 59%. And he's been 60 plus every single healthy season since his rookie season. So he's taking less shots at the basket. He's making less shots at the basket. He's taking more outside shots and not having any more extra success rate in doing so. So it feels like they have kind of deprioritized him on the offensive end a little bit. I've seen some stats that they're running a lot less pick and rolls with him. They're getting Jaren Jackson Jr. much more involved as an offensive sort of hub for the team. And, you know, he's having a great year. I think he's going to get some All-NBA votes. He's 23 points a game, 50% from the field. His shooting is up from where it's been throughout his career. Which, again, maybe all of this is just to conserve Ja and say, hey, let's give you a lighter load, not only from a games played, but from a role on the team perspective in the regular season, and try to maximize what you can be in the postseason, because, you know, he hasn't been healthy in the last couple of years. But I don't know if I can totally get behind this strategy, because I just think that if you play a certain role over the span of an entire season, that kind of is just what your role is. And it's really hard to just flip a switch and play a completely different role come postseason time. And I don't know if I trust Jaren Jackson Jr. as the number 1 option. I just don't. I don't see the initiation and shot creation and the creativity on that end out of him. I think he is best playing off of other players. I think he's more of a spot-up shooter, a guy that can make things happen when you get him the ball in his spots. And, of course, Ja can do that for him. But I worry about what this team is from a shooting and half-court offense, because I think that when the game slows down a little bit, they struggle a little bit more in that capacity. None of that is even to mention the fact that we've seen them be a top 2 team in the West multiple times. 3 of the last 4 years, they've been a top 4 seed. And they've won 1 playoff series in that span. And that was against second-year Anthony Edwards. So the Wolves had no business winning around in the postseason that year. So they really haven't shown that it translates to the postseason yet. And I like a lot of what they have. And I think the infrastructure they built there is awesome. I think Taylor Jenkins has done a great job. I think they're really solid defensively. I think they're deep as hell. But depth only gets you so far in the postseason. You're only going to be playing 8, maybe max 9 guys. So that depth advantage becomes less of an advantage come postseason time. And so I think they'd be better served consolidating some of these pieces, getting some more reliable offensive players to plug into this lineup. But I don't know. I can't get there with Memphis quite yet. And I don't know if I trust them when the game slows down in the last 2 minutes of a game. And I also think that every matchup they play is going to be tough. They're down to the 4 seed right now. If they play Houston, I'll probably pick them over Houston just because they've got similar concerns to me, but amplified to much of a higher degree. But after that, every team that they're going to play is going to be a tough out. And so I think it's less about me not liking Memphis, and I just trust some of the other teams more. I've seen them do it more. They've got more star power, more experience, better track record. And so I'm going to continue to be a little bit skeptical of Memphis. Could they win a round? Absolutely. But I don't know if I see much after that. I don't think they're going to beat Oklahoma City. I don't know if they're going to beat Denver or the Lakers. I don't even know if they would beat Golden State. I think Dallas would be a tough series for them too. I think that there's just too many teams that I don't feel confident that they could knock off. And so I think there's a real ceiling, a cap on what the team can be. I think if Ja Morant plays like an all NBA level player, then a lot of this can sound silly and I'll look stupid in retrospect, but I don't know if he will do that because he has not done that recently. And without him doing that, I don't know how much I believe in this team. And then number 8, the Golden State Warriors. This team, since acquiring Jimmy Butler, has gone 7-1 when he plays, 7-2 overall. He did miss 1 game, but they are a plus 13.3 net rating over that span. They're a plus 13.2 when he is on the court. Their main 5 guys, Steph, Brandon Podziemski, Moses Moody, Jimmy Butler, and Draymond Green, who they've been starting recently, is a plus 14 net rating and 129 possessions. And they have just looked like a totally different team. Steph has been a just completely different player with Jimmy next to him. He has opened so much up for him on the offensive end of the court. They've continued to be really solid defensively. And I said this at the time of the trade that I thought this brought them up a notch, and everything has played out that way. Jimmy, he just brings such a diversification on offense for them. They're really relying on jump shooting, really relying on Steph hitting shots, really relying on Steph and Draymond to be able to have to create everything. Jimmy gives them another creator. He gives them a different look offensively in terms of how he scores. They're 99th percentile in terms of free throw rate when he's been on the court, which this is a team that's been among the league worst in getting to the free throw line. So he's just giving them different looks offensively and taking pressure off Steph, letting Steph be more of a off-ball roamer offensively and not have to be the guy that's actually creating the shot for himself, because Jimmy and Draymond next to him, that's 2 elite level playmakers for their position next to him to be able to get him the ball in a spot. And Jimmy, this is just the ideal role for him. We know that he is not a guy that needs the ball in his hands, that needs to get 20 shots a night. He's cool just doing a lot of the little things, getting Steph his looks and playing both ends of the ball. And so I think people forgot how good Jimmy Butler is. And I said this at the time of the trade. I was high on Phoenix going for him. I was high on this for Golden State. And it's like, he is better than people think he is still. He's still a top 20 guy in the league when he's actually playing and engaged. And so to put that next to Steph, they now have, they could go into any series and have the 2 best players in the series, actually. And with Jimmy, again, it's not even just the 18 points a game that he's going to give, which by the way helps because, they didn't have a lot of just consistent scoring options after Steph, but it's just the way his gravity changes the game. And he's just a high impact guy in that way where you got to account for him. And he's a really good cutter. He plays the way Golden State wants to play. Obviously, he's not a great shooter like they often have had on the team, but like the selflessness offensively, the always moving without the balls, all the little things is exactly what Jimmy Butler does. And so I have been high on this deal for them. And I think Golden State is as like dark horse of a contender as there is in the league right now. I think they're kind of the team that I would not want to face first round as a high seed. And right now, obviously, as I mentioned, they're 7-2 in their last 9 games. They're up into the 7th seed, but they're tied with the Clippers for the 6th seed. So they could very, very easily avoid the play-in altogether, get up to that 6th seed. They're probably in too big of a hole to get up to the 5 seed, for example. But be obviously really nice for them to avoid the play-in. I think that they can not only win a series, I could see them winning 2 series. I don't think it's crazy to say this team can make the finals, actually, because they just check so many boxes. They play hard defensively every single night. They have 2 dudes that could drop 40 on you on any given night. And they've got experience, winning pedigree. I don't know. I think they're not going to be scared of OKC. I think OKC doesn't have size to be able to bother them either. I know Hartenstein's been a good addition, but it's still not like he's a huge weapon on the offensive end. And then Chet's still, frail. So at the end of the day, like Draymond can certainly body him a little bit. So I can't rule it out with this team. I can't rule it out. I was saying this team should blow it up before they got Jimmy, and now I'm saying they should feel pretty good about being able to make a run to even the finals. So do I think they can win the whole thing? Probably not. I think it's unlikely. And could they lose first round? Absolutely. It's very possible on the table that they could end up losing in the first round of the postseason. But if we're talking ceilings, we're talking contender tiers, they are a team that is fully in the mix. And it would not shock me to see them find themselves in the NBA Finals once again. Number 7, the Milwaukee Bucks. This team was a big topic of discussion to start the season. I mean, they started the year 2-8, and since then they've gone 32-17. Only Boston, Oklahoma City, the Knicks, and Cavs have been better over that stretch. That's 54 win pace, and that's a large sample size. So they've been really, really consistently solid for months now. And in that span, they have the 7th best defensive rating. And this is a team that people really were worried about their defense. That was the number one thing everyone talked about last year, and even to start the season, was they didn't have the personnel on the perimeter to be able to guard people. But they've actually been better defensively than they have offensively. I mean, that they're only 11th offensively in that span with the 7th defense, like I mentioned. They're 8th in net rating across the board. And so it's been a nice turnaround. And I think that, I don't think anyone thought they were going to be as bad as the 2-8 start. And I was skeptical about the Kuzma trade as well, but it's looked decent so far. I mean, he hasn't shot the ball super well. Kuzma hasn't, but I think that you can see out on the court that he's playing a little bit more like he did with the Lakers versus how he did on the Wizards. He has been a really solid cutter, being willing to play off ball a little bit more. He gives them a little bit of a different look offensively from what they had with Middleton, where Middleton's more of a ball in his hands, kind of pick and roll player, where Kuzma is better playing off ball maybe. So still don't know how I feel about that trade overall, but I think the early returns on it I see the vision a little bit more. And then Dame, I think, has just looked a little bit more like himself. I think people thought there was a clear decline last season. I wasn't willing to go that far just because of all the stuff going on and the new team, new system. But I think he looks more like the Blazers Dame, and he's like still at a fringe All-NBA level. And then Giannis has still just been spectacular. 31, 12, and 6 on 60% from the field. Like, he is a top 3 player in the world. And even before they turned this thing around, I still never completely lost hope with this team, because when you've got a top 3 player in the world, when you've got Giannis Antetokounmpo on your team, you've got a chance. You got a shot. And I was maybe going to go as far as I don't know about them as a true contender, but, they're in the mix. I think that they've worked their way there. They've been good enough defensively. Dame has been consistent enough. They've gotten enough out of the role guys, and Giannis is that good. He can, if healthy, win them multiple series. And there's not a lot of guys in the league you can say that about. And so with him, I think that they have a chance to make a run. Would I pick them over Cleveland right now? Probably not. But could I see them beating them? Absolutely. Could I see them knocking off the Knicks? Absolutely. Do I think that there's a chance where they make it interesting with Boston? Yes. And so Giannis is like one of those trump cards that's just like you can't totally rule him out. And I know they have been inconsistent in the postseason, to say the least, over the last few years, but that's because Giannis has been hurt largely for most of the series. So if he is healthy, there still isn't a clear, obvious blueprint we've seen to like, oh, Giannis, the Bucks, they're out of the mix. Because the last time we saw him fully healthy, they went toe-to-toe with the Celtics in the second round and lost in 7 games in 2022. The year before that, they won the whole thing, So he just hasn't had the injury luck that he's needed in the postseason recently. If he can get it, I think Milwaukee has a chance to at least be in the discussion. I still think Boston's going to be a really tough out in the East this year. So can they beat Boston? I don't know. But can they at least get themselves to the point where they're playing Boston in a competitive series in the conference finals, for example? I think you'd have to say that, yeah, that's a possibility for this team. Next tier we have is the fully in the mix tier. I'm not going to go as far as to say that any of these teams should be favored. They should not be to win the whole thing, but they are in the discussion. And there's a chance that any of these teams could, make the finals, or even if everything broke their way, maybe win the whole thing. This is when we're getting into the teams that are, I would call, like, legitimate contenders. They are contenders in the sense that, like, they're in the discussion. Like, if something broke their way, wouldn't surprise any of us to see them there towards the end. So, number 6, we have the New York Knicks. And I know there's been a lot of discussion about the struggles that this team has had recently. And I'm very aware of the issues that they have, and I think all of them are valid. But at the end of the day, they are 40-20. They've been really consistent all season long. I think a lot of the knocks come from the fact that they're 0-7 against OKC, Cleveland, and Boston. Their average margin of defeat in those games, 20.1. They've given up 125 points per game to those teams. They've given up 130 plus twice. They've given up 140 another time. And I get all of that. And a lot of those issues stem from the defensive end of the court. And I think that's real. That stuff is real. Since January 31st, they're 28th in defensive rating with a 119 rating, and they're minus 4.5 net rating across the board. I know they're 8-4, and that's bad, but obviously the numbers tell you that they have not played well. And it all starts on the defensive end of the court there, even since January 3rd. So basically, that's 2 months sample now. And since the year has turned to 2025, they're 25th in the league in defensive rating, and they are a minus 0.2 net rating. So they haven't been a good defensive team for 2 months now. They're, all the way to the 20th in the NBA on the season in terms of defensive rating. And all those concerns are real. And I'm fully aware, because, we're going to get to the postseason and they're going to point right at Karl-Anthony Towns and run pick and roll after pick and roll after pick and roll, like we've seen in the past with Towns in Minnesota before Gobert got there, before they were able to hide him a little bit more. And we've seen it this season as well, especially when they played those top teams. So in that sense, I think it's hard to put them in the contender category. But the reason I do have them in this tier and not the previous tier is because of what they could be when Mitchell Robinson is fully back and functional. I know he's played the last couple games, but they big minutes restriction, and who knows if he's even going to be fully healthy come playoff time and able to play a meaningful role. But we've seen Towns and a big, that combination has been successful, and that's when Towns has been at his best as a defensive player. Minnesota was the number 1 defense in the NBA last season, and he was one of the leaders in minutes on the team. He was more than competent in that role as the full-time 4 on the defensive end. And so I think the optionality of having Robinson as the 5 with Towns as the 4, it opens up a lot of possibilities for what this team can be, particularly on the defensive end. And I still have my concerns there. Brunson is, to put it quite frank, a little bit of a liability there. Towns, a little bit of a liability, maybe a huge liability, depending on the lineup and personnel he's playing with. Mikal Bridges, once a all defensive level player, has not played to that standard for a couple of years now. He's finished second in defensive player of the year voting in 2022. Now he looks like an average defender at best at times. It just has not been the same sort of point of attack guy on that end since he's upped his offensive role. So there are questions about the defense, regardless, even with Mitchell Robinson back. But I think that if he is healthy, and this is a big if, I think that they're at least it raises the floor for the team a little bit. I think that he is still a highly impactful rim protector, and he can hide Towns a little bit on that end of the court. And all this paired with the fact that they've been spectacular offensively. Towns, his reputation at taking a hit over the last few years, that is fully built up all the way. He's going to make all NBA team this season. He's been that good. He's been a top 10 guy in MVP discussion this season. And so him with Brunson is about as deadly of a pick and roll or pick and pop combo that we have in this league. Two guys that can drop 40 on any given night that are going to average 25 plus. And then you throw in Anunoby, Bridges, secondary, tertiary scoring options. Josh Hart's had a spectacular season in his role for this team this year. But they've got a lot of holes, obviously, still. I don't trust their bench at all. They've probably got 5.5 dudes that I trust, because I'm not even counting Mitchell Robinson as a full person, because odds are there's a good chance he is hurt. So I just think the range of outcomes is large with New York. I totally think that all the concerns are fair. They have no depth whatsoever. Tibbs continues to play his dudes into the ground, and the defensive shortcomings are real. But at the same time, they've got experience. Towns was in the Western Conference Finals last season. Anunoby's won a championship. Mikal Bridges has been to a finals. Brunson's made a conference finals. All these guys have been there before. And what they can be as an offensive unit is scary for a lot of teams to have to game plan against. And so I think with them, they are going to be a casualty of the bracket, where I don't think they can beat Boston. I just don't. I think that's the one team where it's like they can't beat them. They're not going to beat them, because I think Boston does everything that New York does, but better. And they're way better defensively. You know what I mean? And they're uniquely positioned to be able to attack New York's weaknesses. But I do think that the Knicks, I can't rule them out as a team that could beat Cleveland, for example. I can't rule them out against really anybody else in the East. And so to me, they've got one kryptonite with Boston. But other than that, I think they are a legitimate contender. So I think they're kind of on the fringe of this tier and the last tier. But I think because of the possibility of what Mitchell Robinson can do, the fact that I do think they could have a chance to beat anybody in the East except probably Boston, I think that they're at least in the discussion for this tier of terms of teams that, there is a world where they could make the finals. Like, I think Boston is going to beat them, but what happens if Tatum gets hurt? Then it totally changes the dynamic. And I think New York is totally in the mix after that. That could capitalize on an unlucky situation for Boston or another team or something like that. So I get all the concerns with the Knicks, and I share them. I think that they are a team that has a low floor in terms of what they could potentially be in a postseason setting. But I do think their ceiling is high, and I think that in the right matchups, they can be a really tough out. Number 5, the Los Angeles Lakers. And the Lakers actually currently now sit as the 2 seed in the Western Conference. They're 18-4 in their last 22 games. It was kind of a rough start for Luka individually. The first 3 games, he only averaged 15 points, 7 rebounds, 5 assists on 4 turnovers, 36% from the field, 21% from 3. But he's been a lot better in the 5 games since, 26, 9, and 8. His shooting has still been not great, 41% from the field, but at least it's trending in the right direction. But he's looked like himself, and that's the thing that's scary for other teams, because I think the first couple games he was really struggling to try to fit in. I think he wasn't being himself. I think I don't know if his confidence had taken some hit with the whole situation, but he was trying too hard to just like not overstep, you know what I mean? And I think once they've gotten him back to being like, dude, you're Luka Doncic, like just go be Luka Doncic, it's made a huge difference. And I think that he is starting to get more into his groove, and he's picking up technicals, things like that, complaining to the refs, which of course like can be annoying as a fan, but those are the things that make him who he is. And an emotional Luka is a good Luka for the Lakers. They want him to play with that fire, that emotion, that passion that makes him such a just scary player to play against. And so with him, They've been a plus 9.6 when he's on the floor. They're a plus 4.1 when him and LeBron share the floor, which doesn't sound great, but they are a minus 1.1 with LeBron on the court this season without Luka, which has been a weird subplot of the season for the Lakers, but regardless. And the craziest thing about this team is that everybody was worried about the defense. And I was fully in that group because they don't have really even a league average big man on the roster. And they've got a guy in LeBron who's 40 years old, a guy in Luka who was completely exposed on the defensive end of the court in the finals just last season. But they've been really good there. And I'm not even going to count like the games that AD played because that's a totally different roster. But since Anthony Davis, since his last game with the Lakers, they're first in the NBA in defensive rating at 106.4. That's a 14-game sample. They are 12-2 in that stretch, and they've played plenty of pretty good teams. Clippers 3 times, the Pacers, Knicks, Warriors, Nuggets, Mavs, Wolves, even the Blazers who've been playing well. And over that same span, they're a plus 11 in net rating, which is third in the NBA. And since just Luka arrived, so even just the version of the Lakers that has Luka on it, they are 6-2 when he plays, 7-2 overall. They're plus 6.6 net rating, which is 7th in the NBA. And they're second in the NBA in defensive rating, 106.4. So the defense has just been good with the group they have. And it's a weird, unique approach because, like I said, they don't have a viable big man, but Reeves and Gabe Vincent are really the only guys 6'6" or shorter that get real minutes. Dorian Finney-Smith, Rui Hachimura, Luka, LeBron. All these guys have length and size on the perimeter. Jared Vanderbilt has been an impact player since coming back as well. And I think one of the most underrated parts about this turnaround is the Dorian Finney-Smith acquisition, which was an addition by subtraction by the fact that they got rid of D'Angelo Russell. I've been on record saying that, I was never a huge fan of him in LA. I thought that this team was never going to be able to get over the hump with him as the starting point guard on this team. And so it was as much a just moving on from him as adding Finney-Smith, who's been just an impact guy for them. But they're 20-7 since they added him. They're a plus 14.2 with him on the court. So he has been hugely impactful. And so when they made the Mark Williams trade, I was ready to call them full-on contenders, could make the finals this season. But then once I didn't go through, I backpedaled a little bit on that and was like, it could be tough depending on who they play. Just having Jackson Hayes as the starting center on the team with being forced to play a ton of small ball when you got to go against Jokic, you got to go against Chet and Hartenstein, you got to go against Jaren Jackson Jr. There's just a lot of matchups that could be tough for them. But it is hard to argue with the results. And do I think the Lakers are going to be a top 2 like long term with this group? Probably not. But they don't need to be. They don't need to be. They literally just need to be passable on the defensive end because their offensive potential is through the roof. They have 2 just basketball geniuses, one on the court at all times. And that's not even to mention Austin Reeves, who has developed into probably one of the best third options in the NBA. It's super underrated. And now he's just getting the third best defender on the court. Like, they have scary offensive potential, and their small ball lineups have worked really well. And JJ Redick has just done a phenomenal job. And I think when he really gets a solid game plan together, they're really hard to beat. And I think come postseason time, he's going to be able to really hone in on that. So the Lakers, it sounds crazy to say that they could make the finals after making this trade midseason, but I think they really can make the finals. And I do still have my concerns with them, obviously, with everything that's been said to this point, with the size and the potential defense down the stretch. But I don't know. They're the 2 seed. They got a top 2 player in the world. They got LeBron James on the roster. They got a head coach that has coached his ass off this season and underratedly should be in the coach of the year discussion. They've got a bunch of dudes that are long and strong on the defensive perimeter. And so I think they're legit, and I think they can make the finals. And I think they're going to be a tough out for the Thunder. I think they'd be a tough out for Denver. And they are fully in the mix for me as a team that could, compete with anybody in a series. And maybe the flaws will be too much under a microscope in a postseason setting, but they've been just too impressive across the board for me to think that they couldn't make a run. Number 4, we have the Denver Nuggets, who started the season 16-13. They are since 23-9 with a plus 8.8 net rating, which only Cleveland and Oklahoma City have been better in that span. They've won 11 of their last 14 games, and they've just looked like a different team in the second half. There were a lot of concerns earlier in the year about them in terms of their role players. Did they have the requisite depth to make a deep run? Did they have the requisite shooting and spacing to make a deep run? Do they have enough after Jokic in terms of just complementary pieces like are Murray and Porter Jr. and Aaron Gordon? Are these guys playing up to the level they need them to? And the answer to those questions in the first half was largely no. But in the second half, that has not been the case. Everybody around Jokic has just been significantly better. So in that stretch that I mentioned since late December, Jamal Murray's up to 23 points a game, 6 assists, 51% from the field, 44% from deep. He's been a plus 7.4 on the court. Christian Brown shooting a ridiculous 59% from the field in that span. He's at 16 points a game. He's been a plus 10.2 net rating. He's been great for them. Underratedly having like an insane efficient season for a guard, like to be up in the 58, 59, 60% range is just like unheard of for a guy that does shoot threes a little bit. And again, 6'5" guard. He's not at his size, it's just not normal, but he's a great cutter, great off-ball player, perfect for what this team wants to do with Jokic running the offense. Then Michael Porter Jr., he's kind of had a pretty underrated, really solid season, in my opinion. 19-7 on the year. 51% from the field, 41% from three, just remains super efficient. Still hasn't been able to kind of take reins on like a more elevated offensive role to an extent, but it's hard to complain with the level of efficiency that he has. Then Aaron Gordon, he's just shot the hell out of the ball all season, 42% from deep, 51% from the field. I don't know if that's sustainable for a guy like him who, hasn't shot the ball super well in his career and just has been a below average career 3-point shooter, to put it quite frankly. But you're seeing the contributions out of him and all the other guys. And even Russ, that's been the wild card for them this season. And even in that span I mentioned, he's at 50% from the field, 34% from three, averaging 13, 6, and 6. They're a plus 7.7 in that span when he's been on the court. Everybody's played well around Jokic among their top 6 guys, and so if that continues, then this team, while still not very deep, probably is totally capable of going on a deep run. But I still do have some concerns. I think that we've seen that when they let those guys shoot a little bit, when defenses double Jokic and dare the other guys to beat them, particularly like in Aaron Gordon, for example, they have struggled a little bit. I also just like their rotation is really thin still, in my opinion. I mean, after the top 6 guys, which, I say we trust 6, but do you really trust Russ in a postseason setting? Still TBD in this setting, but we'll have to see. But after that, it's like Peyton Watson, Julian Strawther, those guys. It's pretty much an 8-man rotation with those 2 dudes rounding it out. And I don't trust either of those guys, really. We haven't seen it consistently out of them. We haven't seen it in the postseason. They're still, sporadic a little bit offensively. And then Strawther's a mixed bag on the defensive end of the court. Peyton Watson's obviously really solid there. But all that to say, I still think the depth issues are a bit of a concern. And I also don't know how Russ will translate to the postseason because he's just been a mixed bag. You can't argue that for sure that he's going to be an impact guy in the postseason. And if he becomes unplayable, which is very possible, then they're super thin. They just don't have anybody after their top, like their starting 5. And that was an issue last year. And it's just really tough to win. We've seen recently that teams that can go a really strong 7 or 8 guys, those are the teams that have had a lot of success in the postseason recently. We haven't seen a lot of these super top heavy teams go far in the modern NBA. And so that's a concern. But ultimately, they've got Jokic. He's averaging 29, 10, and 13 on 58% and 44% from three. I mean, he's the best player in the world. They're always going to have a chance, even if everything went wrong. Russ sucks. They're not getting anything out of the guys after them. They were always going to be in the mix, regardless, just because of him alone. And so if those guys play well and hit shots, then, they're probably the biggest threat to Oklahoma City at this point in the West. I think you'd have to say that. I know, again, the Lakers are a little bit more of a wild card, it feels like. But I think you can't rule them out, in terms of even just getting to the finals. I don't know if they have enough to win the whole thing. But, like, they looked dominant in the postseason 2 years ago. Last year, they were as close as humanly possible to beating Minnesota without beating them. And they had a 20-point lead in Game 7 in the second half. So they win that series. They maybe beat Dallas. It's like we could be talking about Denver totally differently depending on if they had just won that series in the second round last year. So I still think Denver is a real force to be reckoned with. I think that they are a safe bet as the number 2 team in the West right now. And they have their question marks, but they are fully entrenched as a contender as currently constructed. And last team in this tier, number 3, the Cleveland Cavaliers. And they have been spectacular. And it might feel like a mistake to put them not in the number 1 tier, because look, they have the 6th best net rating in the history of the NBA at plus 11.5. They've been that good. They're currently 50-10. They could really flirt with close to 70 wins depending on how they close the season, just because they've won 10 or more games 3 separate times. They started the year 15-0. They had another 12-game winning streak. They are currently on a 10-game win streak. And if you just look at all the teams above them in terms of the top net rating of all time, the 96 Bulls won a championship. The 97 Bulls won the championship. The 2017 Warriors won the championship. And last year Celtics won the championship. And then the other team is actually the Thunder also this season. So the point is, teams with that good of a net rating typically win the whole thing. And so for me to kind of discount them a little bit, again, it feels unfair. But I just have slight concerns about not having seen it translate to the postseason yet. They made the second round last season, but they beat a depleted, undermanned, not that talented Orlando Magic group, and it still went 7 games. And I know that Cleveland is better on paper in so many ways this year. Even just the addition of DeAndre Hunter, they are 8-0 so far since he has been inserted into the lineup. They're a plus 16 when he's been on the court. They're a plus 20 in terms of him plus the other core 4 guys they have in Mobley, Mitchell, Garland, and Allen. So he has been a spectacular add for them. Ty Jerome has been just an unsung hero for this team as a spark plug scorer off the bench, really legitimately putting himself in the 6th man of the year conversation. Mitchell, his stats are down, but that is by design. Mobley's taken a big step up. Garland is back to looking like the normal version of what we'd seen out of him before last season. And Kenny Atkinson just has this group clicking on pretty much every facet of the basketball court. So I understand why it would seem kind of silly not to have them in at least in the number 1 tier, not necessarily number 1 favorite, but I'm still just slightly hesitant with them. I think they're really, really good, but I want to see it. I want to see it in the postseason because I just think if they had looked more competent in the postseason in the past, I would have less of a concern because I think that they truly have been like a complete shell of what they've been in the regular season over the past 2 seasons in the postseason. Even though they won around last year, it was an ugly win. And the year before that, they were the presumed favorite in the series and kind of got their asses kicked. And so I'm not saying that they can't get to another level. I think them making the finals completely on the table. I think they have a nice little, I won't say cakewalk, but a nice path just to the conference finals as sort of a floor. As I mentioned, Milwaukee at least would have a chance in that series in the second round, but I think you have to favor Cleveland just given the season that they've had and Milwaukee's postseason struggles over the last few seasons. And so it really comes down to, can they beat Boston? And it's not just the, lack of me seeing it with them in the past. The roster construction, it's atypical for a championship team. They don't have an MVP caliber guy on the team. Donovan Mitchell is awesome, and he's going to make probably first team All NBA this year, at the very least, second team All NBA, and he's deserving of that. And they've got their top 4 guys are as good as anybody's top 4 guys in the whole league. But historically, most teams that win the championship have a guy, at least someone like a Tatum who, you could argue he's also not MVP level, but he's about as close as he could be without being it. I mean, I think it's safe to say Tatum's like a top 5 player in the league at this point. And even Mitchell's not quite at that level. Tatum's made a couple consecutive first team All NBAs. You kind of just pencil him in there at this point, which again, Mitchell is just not there. And so there's a couple red flags, and I get the numbers have been insane and the team's been ridiculously good. And it's hard to argue against any of that. But just we've seen it look questionable in the postseason in the past. They have technically taken their losses, so they are on the natural progression to be able to contend. But I just worry down the stretch, deep in the postseason, is Mitchell going to play like an MVP level player? And we've seen him do it. Absolutely, we've seen him do it, but we've also seen him not do it. And he's had some ugly postseason performances at times. He's had peaks in the postseason as high as basically anybody. And so I just don't think they should be the favorites, because I just think that Boston, they still hold that title in the East. And so if you're not the favorite to win every series in your conference, then it's hard for me to put you in that number one tier, because that tier to me is defined by the teams that should be viewed as being the favorites. And Cleveland is in the mix, 100%. They can make the finals. They probably could win the whole thing if things broke their way a little bit. But the other thing is they haven't been the favorites like this in the past. So will they be able to handle the pressure of like if they lose second round, that's a huge disappointment. You lose to Milwaukee in round 2, it's not going to be good for Cleveland. You know what I mean? And so that's a whole other animal that they have yet to tackle. And so we will see if they can do it. I have them as the number 3 team in the entire NBA, so it's not like I'm completely disrespecting them, but I still a little bit of skepticism for them in terms of can they actually win a championship this season? And that's kind of where we're at in the range of teams right here. And the final tier, the top tier, that is the favorites. We've got 2 teams in this tier, which I'm sure you know who they are at this point, the Oklahoma City Thunder and the Boston Celtics. So starting with number 2, we have the Oklahoma City Thunder, who to me are the overwhelming favorites in the Western Conference. I know that the West has proven to be a pretty strong this year, but they are head and shoulders above the other teams in that conference. I mean, 10.5 games up as the 1 seed. Like, they are a lock to get the 1 seed. They're going to be able to basically sit all their guys over the last week or 2 of the season just because they built such a lead. And they currently have the second best net rating in the history of the NBA of all time. Only the 96 Bulls are higher, which most people view that as the greatest team of all time, if not one of the greatest teams of all time. And so just looking at all the other teams in that tier, I touched on this for when I went through Cleveland, but all of the other top 5 teams in terms of net rating, they all won the championship. If you look at the top 10, 9 of the other teams have won the championship as well. So like history says, if you're that good from a net rating perspective, like you should win the championship. And I know obviously Cleveland's also in the top 10, so one of those teams will not win it. But Oklahoma City's just been, I think, underratedly good. It is not talked about enough about how dominant they've been this season. And I think that they check a lot of the boxes. I know Cleveland, like I said, I had my skepticism about them. I know that they have a similar statistical profile to Oklahoma City, so you might be wondering why so high on the Thunder, but not on the Cavs. I'll also just say it's only one spot ahead. It's not like I'm that much higher, but I think that they check every single box. They've taken their playoff losses last year, losing as a favorite in the second round. They have an MVP level player in Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who probably is going to win the MVP this season. And that's a big differentiator for me versus Cleveland. They are devastating on the defensive end of the court. They have been the number 1 defensive team in the NBA all season long. They are still really good on offense, a top 5 offense as well. And so they've got size, they've got length, they've got shooting, they've got versatility. Mark Dagnall's a really good coach. Like they check every box. And really there's only one real question mark with Oklahoma City, in my opinion, and that is the offensive second option, which Jalen Williams, he made the All-Star game this year, deservingly so. He's been really good. But can he be the consistent, reliable number 2? That's really the only question I have. And that's the question that I have said all season long for Oklahoma City. And I think he is capable of it. I don't know for certain if he will be it, but I think he can be it. And so it's just going to see how does it play out, because he shrunk a little bit in the second round last year. He didn't play up to the standard they needed him to in order to be that guy for them against Dallas, and they lost because of it. And so it's not off the table that something like that could happen again and they could fall short. But I think SGA is playing at a different level from last year. I think Chet is going to be more capable to pick up some of the slack there if J-Dub does struggle at times. I think Hartenstein is going to play a huge difference in terms of what he does for this team as a rebounder and an interior presence, which they also really struggled in the postseason last year with. And then Kason Wallace, just another year of experience and play for him. Alex Caruso is just a better fit in the Josh Giddey spot than they had last year. So I think there's a lot of reasons to believe that they can kind of solve a lot of the issues that they ran into in the postseason last year. But ultimately, it's going to come down to, can Jalen Williams average 21, 22, 23 points per game in the postseason? When SGA is not playing well, can he pick up the slack? If SGA is getting his, can somebody else give him some help when the double teams start coming and stuff like that? And so I think the answer is yes. I think Oklahoma City is being slept on. I mean, as I said, the statistical profile is kind of ridiculous and nobody's really talking about it. And the lead they have in the West is absurd. And so I think they can win the championship this season. They were my pick preseason to win the championship. So obviously I thought they could to start the year, but I've seen nothing to say that I shouldn't still believe that, because they're that good. They have looked the part in basically every facet. I just think they're really, really good. And then number one, the Boston Celtics. They've kind of flown under the radar a little bit this season. They are still, 43-18, super good, but they're 7.5 games behind Cleveland. So I get it. They're not the talking point in the East this year. And then you throw an OKC to the mix, and they're kind of like the forgotten third team to an extent. But to me, they are still the favorite. The NBA runs through them until they lose, because they were dominant last year. They were dominant in the postseason last year. They've been largely dominant this season. And so I haven't seen anything to think that they shouldn't continue to be viewed as the favorite in the NBA right now. I mean, they had a little stretch where they went 11-10, which they didn't have a stretch like that last year. But, since then they've gone 11-3 in their last 14. And their recent losses were to the Red Hot Pistons and Cleveland, obviously, who came back from down 25-3 in that game. But they're on pace for 58 wins. They have a plus 8.8 net rating. They've done a really good job of managing a lot of their guys. I think they've been resting Drew Holiday a little bit more this year, similarly to what they've done with Al Horford, to try and make sure that they're fresh for the postseason. And I think Tatum has even leveled up a little bit this year. I know the shooting stats aren't crazy different from where they've been throughout his prime, but they're just running so much more offense through him. What he's done as a facilitator and playmaker is just at a totally other level from where he's been in the past. He's averaging a career high 5.8 assists on the season. He is just evolved into this like Swiss Army knife type player where he does everything. He's great on the defensive end. He is like to the point where they run the offense through him as an initiator and facilitator, because they don't really have a true point guard on the team, but he's so capable of that now. He still obviously can average close to 30 points a game or even above that. But I just think that, again, last postseason, we got kind of like a meh Tatum. So if we get Tatum locked in and playing and shooting the ball the way we know he can, there's still another level that I think Boston could get to compared to what we saw in the postseason last year. And then you add in the fact that like Peyton Pritchard is playing at an elevated level from what he did last year as a real threat off the bench. You've still got Derek White, Drew Holiday, Jaylen Brown, and Porzingis to put probably the best starting five in the NBA together right there. And so I haven't seen anything out of Boston that makes me think that they should not still be the prohibitive favorite. I still think the East runs through them. I think the entire NBA runs through them. And whoever wins the championship is going to have to knock them off. Until we see that happen, they are the favorite to me. I know I've talked a lot about how parity's big in the NBA right now and repeating's really, really hard. And I still do believe that. And so if you ask me the field or Boston, I might take the field still, but somebody's got to be the most likely to win it. And to me, it's still Boston, just because I know repeating is hard, but there's still just little things you can pick about every team. And I think Boston, if they're healthy, they've got a pretty clear path to the at least Eastern Conference Finals, because I think they match up really well with New York. They're going to have a breeze first round. And then Cleveland, I think a lot of pressure is going to be on Cleveland because they're going to have home court. They're going to have the most to prove, and Boston can kind of lean into their experience and go from there. And then once they're in the finals, Oklahoma City would be a really tough matchup. But I think anybody else they play out of the West is just a clear notch below where Boston is. So to me, they're the team to beat. The NBA runs through Boston. I still think they're the favorite, despite the fact that, Cleveland and Oklahoma City are having ridiculous regular seasons so far. And that's going to do it for this episode of the Sean Jones NBA show. I apologize for that being so long, but I really wanted to be pretty thorough talking through every single team. Didn't want to shortchange anybody, even some of the tanking teams that we do have. But that is kind of my view of where we're at with the league and with each team and where I see them as a contender. But, it'll be really fun to see how the next 2 months and the rest of the regular season plays out. There's still plenty of seeding still to be shaken out, particularly in the West play-in situation. And it'll be really fun to start to see who is going to end up playing who, what matchups are we going to get come postseason. But we'll talk about all that leading up to it before the postseason. But with that said, thank you so much for listening, and I will chat with you soon.